talk about faith. We know that without faith it's impossible to please God. We know that faith is important. But we also know that it's easy to lose our faith. There are so many things. You know, faith is hard to keep when you're suffering personal tragedies. It's hard to believe in the loving God when things are going wrong. But Job did. And his was even made worse because while going through these personal tragedies, he felt that God was not keeping up his end of the covenant he had with God because he misunderstood the covenant he had with God. So it was easy for his faith to waver. We live in a time when there are people that are telling us that it is stupid to believe in God. Your kids are being taught that God did not create. Faith is being assailed from every direction. And it is so easy to lose faith. But faith is the evidence of things unseen. You know, I think some people don't even realize they're quoting when they say that. If you ever read any mystery novels, the detective always comes in, the amateur detective, because they know their friend didn't do it. Why? Because they have faith in their friend. They know their friend could not have done it. No matter what the other evidence says, their evidence says they aren't guilty and they go to prove it. That's the kind of faith that God wants, is the faith that stands when it makes no earthly sense. Standing, having faith when faith makes no earthly sense. And we have an entire book of the Bible that is dedicated to that premise. It's the book of Daniel. That is the message of the entire book. Even though the book is in 2 different sections, and I might even say 3 sections because one is a quote from Nebuchadnezzar. But it's at least 2 sections, if not 3 sections. But the entire focus of the book, from the very beginning to Daniel's prophecy, says, have faith when faith makes no earthly sense. We're going to start with Daniel, the 1st chapter and the 1st verse. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the vessels of the house of God, and he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. The northern kingdom has long since been led into captivity. It's long since gone. has to shake the faith, even though the people know that it was prophesied. It has to shake the faith. But now, here in the 5th century, before Christ, Jerusalem, the holy city, is sacked. Its walls are breached and knocked down, torn apart. The temple is torn apart. Jehoiakim is taken by Nebuchadnezzar. Even the gold vessels from the temple are taken. Even though Jeremiah prophesied that it would happen if they didn't straighten up. You know that had to shake faith, don't you? The holy spot of their religion, the temple, where God dwelled and sat on the mercy seat, has been torn up. People in those days felt that everything had to do with the gods. Today, Christians believe in God having a role to play, but in those days, every nation had its own gods, and they believed in those gods. And if you lost a war or a battle, it meant that your God was defeated by their God. That was the way that the world saw everything. Do Christians today see things sometimes in the way the world sees them rather than the way the Bible presents them? Is it easier to believe in the theory of evolution than the first chapter of Genesis? For some people, it really is. Imagine living in that time. Your God has been defeated. His house on this earth is in shambles. It has been looted. We know that this was important, and we know that the people believed that. Back in 1 Samuel, the 5th chapter, verses 1 through 4, we'll go look at that, because that tells of another time when God did something to show his people that he hadn't lost. 1 Samuel 5, verses 1 through 4. When the Philistines captured the ark of God, they brought it from Ebenezer to Ashdod. Then the Philistines took the ark of God and brought it into the house of Dagon and set it up beside Dagon. And when the people of Ashdod rose early the next day, behold, Dagon had fallen face downward on the ground before the ark of the Lord. So they took Dagon and put him back in his place. But when they rose early on the next morning, behold, Dagon had fallen face downward on the ground before the ark of the Lord. And the head of Dagon and both his hands were cut off on the threshold. Only the trunk of Dagon was left to him. Why did this happen? It happened because God was showing that even though the Israelites had been defeated because they were unfaithful, that's why they were defeated, he was saying, my power is still here, I am still God, and I want you Philistines to know your God didn't beat me. I allowed this to happen to punish and wake up my people. Well, I'm sure the people would really have liked that had they done that when Judah was led into captivity. But they didn't get that. They saw the destruction of their way of life, of everything. Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance, skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace, and to teach them the literature and the language of the Chaldeans. Members of the nobility, some even of the house of David, are taken into captivity. Now, this is certainly better than the captivity of bringing them in and putting the work in the fields. But it's still captivity. The king assigned to them a daily portion of the food that the king ate and of the wine that he drank, and they were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time they were to stand before the king. Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. And the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar. Hananiah he called Shadrach. Mishael he called Meshach. And Azariah he called Abednego. Not only has their religion been shaken, been despised, they're now given pagan names. Their names meant something. Daniel means God is my judge. I think we've all seen the show Roots, one or both of them. Do you remember the scene when they're trying to tell him his new name and he refuses to take it because his name is who he is? Well, these guys didn't say, no, you can't call me. You can call me whatever you want, and I'll answer. But they knew who their names were. That's why Daniel is referred to by himself as this throughout. Now, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, other times, they're referred to by their Babylonian names. But at that particular part, when they're called Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, before they go into the fiery furnace, if you look at that closely, you see that it's a quote of the people talking to Nebuchadnezzar. And so they are going to use their Babylonian names. But they also held on to their name and their identity as children of God. Why should you keep the name Daniel? God is my judge, when obviously God has been overthrown. I mean, that's the way that it felt. Imagine being one of these young men. Jerusalem was the biggest thing that city they'd ever seen. It was the king's city. It was a holy city. And it was wonderful. Well, they just saw the holes in the wall and the temple down. And now they come into Babylon. Babylon is so much bigger than Jerusalem. The walls are so much higher and wider. And the gold that was in the temple is everywhere. It's a glorious city, beautiful city. And people are singing and dancing and laughing and having parties. And back home, everybody's crying. Makes no earthly sense to have faith. Everything that their faith was based on has been ground into rubble. Most people would give up, would become Babylonian. You know, if you can't beat them, join them. But Daniel resolved he would not defile himself with the king's food, nor with the wine that he drank. Therefore he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. And God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who assigned your food and your drink. For why should he see that you were in worse condition than the youths who are of your own age? So you would endanger my head with the king. Then Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had assigned over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. The actual word there is seeds. So it includes grains, vegetables, and those kind of things. And then let our appearance and the appearance of the youths who eat the king's food be observed by you, and deal with your servants according to what you see. After all this, you want to keep kosher? After all this, you're not willing to eat the best food in the land because some of it is unclean, because some of it may have been offered to the idols, because it may not have been processed correctly. I mean, that's just silly food regulations. That the knife that cuts the throat of the cow has to be a certain length and can't have any nicks in it. That the cow has to be killed by cutting its throat so that the blood is not in it. With everything going on, they go, no, we can't do this. We can't give up on our God. They may think it's silly. Other people have lost their faith, but they have not lost their faith. They're willing to keep kosher. And the best way to do that when they're in this training thing is give us vegetables and water. Because I don't know what you've done with that wine. I don't know that food, and I don't want to dishonor my God. I worship the Lord God, and I will follow his rules. So they're willing to become vegetarians. Now, I'll tell you how serious it is. In the prison system, when people want to eat kosher, since we don't have a kosher kitchen, that's what they get. Vegetables. But they're not even cut. They are given whole carrots, whole onions, whole celery, because today, to make sure, just as Daniel and his men wanted to make sure they were not accidentally defiled, today, Orthodox Jews believe that if you cut meat, and then you cut vegetables, and then maybe you have dairy, then that violates the not boiling the kid in its mother's milk. Now that's their interpretation of it, but so, no, you are given the fresh vegetable that hasn't been touched by a knife, because that knife might have been unclean. But there they go. They eat it, and guess what? They did good. This is just the first instance, and there'll probably be more as I want to do a few things from Daniel to say, faith when there is no earthly reason is the only kind of real faith there is. If your faith is shaken by a science teacher, if it's shaken by personal tragedy, if it is shaken by having religious leaders be proved to be evil, you don't have true faith in the living God. We need to be like these young men. Don't you think it's interesting that it wasn't all the youths that came? They took hundreds of people. And you've got 4 that are saying, no, our God is still alive. Our God is here. And I'm going to cover some of the other things in Daniel, but is your faith strong like Daniel's? Are you willing to say, God is my judge? Not the laws, not the government, not what people think. God is my judge, and I will follow the Lord my God. If those men who saw their world crumble, who saw the temple defiled, can say, I will follow the Lord my God, in something that we would say is probably pretty stupid. Just so I know for sure I'm not going to disrespect my God. We need to be people of faith, that same kind of faith, that no matter what happens, we have the evidence of things unseen that outweighs all the evidence that we can see. All the evidence they could see is God is dead. But the evidence they believed was that God was living, and he proved it. If anybody needs to answer the invitation in a public way,